Sit back and listen to this extremely interesting story. Andy stared wide-eyed, his pulse quickening as he watched the spectacle unfold. Jenna teased Dean, admiring him greedily. She began to please him. Dean groaned, his hand grabbing Jenna's hair, guiding her. Jenna pulled away from Dean and looked playfully at Andy. "Show your admiration, Andy. I want to see how excited you are. I want you to enjoy yourself while you watch. You know how you used to do that on our bed while we were gone," she finished with a devilish wink. Andy hesitated for a moment, his gaze resting on Jenna's attractive figure. He swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest, and uncertainly began to fulfill her wishes. Jenna's eyes widened in surprise, her lips parting slightly. "Oh, Andy," she murmured with a smile, "it's so average," she giggled. Andy flushed red, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. He had hoped his average size would go unnoticed, but looking down at it and then at Dean's, he knew she wasn't wrong. Nevertheless, Jenna's comment cut deep. Her eyes moved from Andy back to a much more impressive Dean. She smiled and gave Andy another wink before continuing her business with Dean. Andy watched, mesmerized, as Jenna expertly worked her way up, enjoying every second with Dean. Dean's breathing became louder, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He gripped Jenna's hair tightly, his knuckles turning white. "Do you like it, Andy?" Jenna cooed, her eyes fixed on Dean. "Does it make you want to touch it, Andy?" she teased, reaching out to lightly tug at Andy's arm. Andy pulled away quickly. "What? No," he said. "I do not want to touch it." Andy replied, swallowing hard. He watched as Jenna continued to perform oral magic on Dean's magnificent tool. He couldn't help but compare his own meager offering with Dean's impressive gift. He sighed inwardly, a wave of self-pity washing over him. Jenna pulled away from Dean and looked at Andy. A mischievous glint appeared in her eyes. "Enjoying the show? Please yourself faster than me, Andy," she coaxed. "Watch me please Dean while you work alone. Let's see if you can last longer than Dean." Andy hesitated, his eyes locked on Jenna's attractive figure. He swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest as he reluctantly complied. He watched as Jenna continued to please Dean, his envy growing stronger. That tastes so good," Jenna moaned, not looking at Andy. She was becoming more skilled. Dean continued to moan, eyes closed, enjoying the sensations coursing through him. Andy kept his eyes on Jenna as she continued to please Dean. He watched her masterfully work. Andy couldn't help but envy Dean's position. "Faster, Jenna," Dean growled, his hands gripping her head tightly. She obediently followed the order. Andy sat transfixed with excitement. "Harder, Andy," Jenna ordered, glaring at him. "Do it faster. Show us how desperate you are to be satisfied." Andy complied. He was working at a frantic pace. He looked over at Dean, noticing a satisfied smile on his face. Andy blushed, looking away. Jenna giggled softly, sensing the tension between the two men. She let go of her husband before lifting her head to look at Andy again. "Tell me, Andy," Jenna said, her voice laced with interest. "Do you like watching me please Dean? He is almost twice as brave as you." She was teasing. Andy tensed. Her words struck, but did little to restrain his furious movements. Instead, he focused on her mesmerizing performance, his excitement building. Jenna did a great job, showing a skill honed by countless hours of practice. Jenna mumbled, "Do you think Abby would like that kind of manliness, Andy?" Andy cringed, trying not to imagine his wife next to Dean. But he felt not only jealousy. Jenna's abuse of Dean and his wife caused Andy to break up in a frenzy. Flashes to Abby standing in front of Dean, just like Jenna is now. Her eyes settled on Andy while she was pleasuring Dean. Andy was ready for some fun. "Andy," Jenna muttered, "I'm going to make Dean happy now. I want you to imagine you're Abby enjoying herself with Dean, just like I am, making him happy, just like I'm going to. That's it. Finish and you for me, Andy. Have fun for me while you figure it out." Jenna teased. Her words touched Andy, igniting a storm of conflicting emotions. Humiliated and excited at the same time, he gave all his strength to his work. "Can you imagine that, Andy? Pleasure me, baby." Jenna purred, her eyes locked on Andy and her hands locked on Dean. It was too much for Andy, and he felt his satisfaction coming. Jenna's constant teasing was too much for him to bear. He exploded with pleasure. Jenna watched with glee as Andy let out a loud moan. She turned her attention to her husband again and began to please him faster. Her eyes were locked on Andy as she continued to taunt him. Andy squirmed uncomfortably as he watched. Now that he had finished what he had begun, the excitement subsided and he wanted to vanish into thin air, to escape the reality of his inferiority. He looked down at himself and what he had done. Then suddenly it was Dean's turn to finish as Jenna was practicing masterfully. Jenny took in his wave of pleasure. That was delicious. Jenna purred, her eyes sparkling mischievously. He watched mesmerized as Jenna proudly displayed the result of Dean's pleasure. He couldn't deny the intoxicating effect it had on him, how incredibly attractive Jenna looked at that moment. Despite his humiliation, and regardless of what happened afterward, he knew he would remember that image for months when he was alone. Dean broke him from his reverie and began to fasten his pants. "Time to go, Andy." Andy nervously stood up and composed himself. He took one last look at them both, unsure of what to say or what to do next. "Don't worry, Andy," Jenna finally said as he reached the door. "We will be in touch if we need anything else." Andy's heart sank as he closed the door behind himself and retreated to his house. Relief washed over him, but his comfort was brief. Jenna's words replayed in his head, and it filled him with dread. He was sure this was just the beginning, that his neighbors fully intended to hold this over his head. But what exactly would they do? What did they want from him? He had to figure out a way out of this. No matter what it took, no matter what they wanted from him, he couldn't let Abby see that video. He wouldn't let that happen. Part 3 coming soon. Actually, I've decided to stay for at least another week. We are doing some important work here, and we need time to finish. The whole lot of you are staying. How is that possible? No, the others are going to fly out tomorrow. I am staying here to help finish this job. Margaret, you should be returning with your group tomorrow. You only took 2 weeks vacation time. You should be back in the office on Monday. I've asked for an extra week. They are giving me the week off without pay. Without pay, why don't you just come back? This project is not your responsibility. I'm sorry, Paul, but it's important work. I'll keep in touch. She hung up. I tried to call her back, but there was no answer. I was frustrated beyond belief. I phoned the church office to talk to someone in charge of the mission. Nobody in the office had any information. The leader of the mission was on the island with the mission team, and they were expected back early tomorrow morning. This was so atypical for Margaret that it had me worried. She was so adamant that she go on this mission, and now she wants to stay later than the rest of the crew. I showed up at the airport when the others were scheduled to be back. I found the leader and asked to speak to them. They were a bit miffed, but when I explained who I was, they gave me some time to talk. Why is Margaret staying behind? I really don't want to get involved in any marital dispute, Paul. Margaret told me she wanted to stay behind to help the organization wrap up what we started. Why her? What special skills does she have that necessitated her being left behind? She is a 40-year-old woman. She can make up her own mind to stay or go whenever she pleases. I don't know the specifics. She just said she was staying. That was all I was going to get from them. I knew that Margaret's friend Doreen had gone on this mission, and Doreen was the biggest gossip in the parish. I called Doreen, and she was a little more forthcoming. Margaret seemed to be very friendly with the local manager of the mission on the island. They were frequently huddled together talking or eating lunches. Our social events saw them together a lot. I'm not saying there was anything going on between them, but they were pretty friendly. What is the director's name? Frank King. Thanks, Doreen. I hope it was a good mission. I kept trying to get through to Margaret's line but got no answer. Finally, a week later, she called me. Paul, I'm really sorry. I have some news. I quit my job. You quit? What are you doing? Why, they want to hire me here full-time. I will be working with the mission management company. You won't believe all the good we are doing for these people. You've lost your mind, Margaret. You are thousands of kilometers away from home. What about our marriage? I love you, Paul. I know it will be hard, but we can do it. Many couples have long-distance relationships for a short time. Yes, like my friend who ended up divorced. Margaret, this is the kind of thing we need to decide together, not unilaterally. If we discussed it, you would simply say no. So I needed to make the decision myself. We are doing good work here, Paul. Please don't be selfish. When you say we, do you mean Frank King and yourself? That name elicited a long pregnant pause. They've told you about Frank. Oh yes, they have. He is a very dedicated humanitarian. He is a wonderful man and boss. So he's the one who hired you? Yes. What else have they told you, Paul? Well, they suggested that your relationship with Frank might be a little more intimate than business. Just a bunch of rumor mongers. I am not happy. How long will you be there? I signed on for 6 months. 6 months? You know what, Margaret? Don't swear, Paul. I want you to come home now. I'm not going to wait 6 months for you to come back. It will pass quicker than you know it will. The phone cut out at that point, or she hung up mid-sentence, which I find more likely. I was beyond anger. I was nearing apoplexy. I complained to the pastor of the church, who told me it was out of his control. I spoke to the missionary society and complained that Frank King was luring and probably spending time with my wife on that island. They seemed hopeless, but they accepted my complaint. Another 2 weeks passed before another phone call came in from my wayward wife. "Why are you spreading so much gossip about me and Frank? The missionary society asked a lot of questions, and you started it all." "No, you are the one who started it all by staying behind." "Well, just stop it. I'll be home when I'm home and not until." This time I hung up. This was approaching intolerable. If she wasn't coming home, then I was going to her. I wasn't going to go empty-handed. I visited my lawyer, who prepared a petition to dissolve our marriage. Getting tickets to fly the island was expensive and a pain in the ass, but it was necessary. 5 hours in the air was about the maximum bearable for me, so I was happy to see land. It was still dark in the early morning hours. The village where they were working was a tiny place. The mission staff were sleeping in tents on the site of a building they were restoring. I asked some of the security people where I would find Margaret and was told she'd be with Frank. They pointed to a tent in the center of the compound. I noticed the tent was zipped up. I knocked on the canvas but got no answer. I grabbed the zip and opened the flap. Frank King was lying there in a very large sleeping bag. Frank and my wife Margaret. I coughed loud enough to wake them up. "What you want?" he shouted. "My wife, if you don't mind, Frank." I said calmly. Margaret shrieked. "Paul, what are you doing here?" "You aren't supposed to be here," she cried out as she began to weep. "Frank, why don't you fuck off for a few minutes while I talk to my wife?" Frank got out of his sleeping bag. He pulled on his jeans and left the tent. Margaret sat up but lifted the sleeping bag to make sure she was covered. Really tiny. Modesty. I've seen you naked 1,000 times. You hang out like this with your boyfriend and your boss, but you're modest with me. Realizing this was foolishness, she dropped the bag to reveal herself, the one I had loved for 15 years. "What are you doing here, Paul?" "I have come to collect my wife and bring her home with me." "You know I can't do that. I've signed on for 6 months. "So what are the penalties for quitting early?" "I wouldn't get paid for any of the work until the end of the contract." "So strictly monetary?" "Yes." "Then I will buy out your contract. I'll pay you what you have earned. I want to do this, Paul." "What do you want to do?" "Stay here and have your boss by your side and spend time with him for 6 months, and in 6 months you'll sign another 6, or maybe then go home to your cheating husband." "I'll come home after the first 6 months, I promise. If I renew, I will come back here afterwards." "Not good enough, Margaret. If you want any possibility of saving our marriage, you will pack your bags and come with me this morning. We can fly back home on the next plane out. Then we will go through counseling to deal with this." "I can't, Paul." "If you don't, then this is the alternative." I handed her the petition for divorce in an envelope. "Come with me now or sign, and we'll end this marriage." She sat looking at the envelope. Tears rolled down her cheeks. She got up and came to me. She hugged me and I hugged her back. She was without clothes and her hug made me worry so much. I kissed her for a long time and she answered me. My hands reached for her. She was so gentle. I could feel the excitement building. She stood in front of me and pleasured me for first time in years. She wasn't gentle either. She wanted to satisfy me as soon as possible. I took off my clothes. We spent time on the sleeping bag until I felt her pleasure. 10 minutes later, Frank came in. "We're not done yet." He stood and watched me with Margaret. I forgot about Frank and focused on getting my wife back. Frank was standing next to us, pleasuring himself at the same pace as we were. Margaret's eyes were locked on mine. I moaned as I spoke one word to her. "Mine." Her eyes never wavered as she replied, "Yours." She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at Frank as he pleasured himself faster. She moaned, then looked into my eyes and spoke, "Mine, yours." I replied. I focused on Margaret and worked as hard as I could. Before I was satisfied, I heard Frank grunt, "Go away, Frank." He pulled the jeans on and dashed out of the tent. In retrospect, mine was a primitive response. Call it the caveman brain or the lizard brain. All I knew was that logical thinking was in short supply. The only thing that mattered then was getting the woman I loved back. Paul, where did all that passion come from? "Come with me now or sign the divorce papers. I know which I prefer, but this is your choice." She got up and got dressed. I helped her wash up. She packed her things and we left the tent. Frank told her she would lose all her pay. She told him that she resigned anyway. As she loaded up my rental Jeep, I took Frank aside. Frank, only someone like you would take advantage of an innocent middle-aged woman like Margaret and make her his plaything. You knew she was married, but you were with her anyway. I'll make sure you get sent home eventually. I will do everything in my power to ensure that you are never hired by any NGO working on this planet. Isn't Margaret the first benefactor you've conquered? I use all my willpower not to hurt you, but I'll probably get hurt if I do. Your guards are armed, and I wouldn't get out of here alive, so I will have my revenge. It will only be delayed and not as physical as I would like. If you're thinking about beating me up before we go, just remember that a lot of people know where I am. If I don't come back, you'll have to pay. Margaret was sitting in the jeep waiting. It was a quiet drive to airport, and then a short wait for a flight home. Once we got home and settled, Margaret came to me. Paul, can we talk? Sure, what's on your mind? I want to understand what happened to me and why. Frank was the man in charge. He was so good to us, but he seemed to pay me more attention. I was flattered. Marg, you are a beautiful, mature 40-year-old woman. You may not realize just how attractive you are. I accept some of the blame for that. How many times have I told you how beautiful you are lately? Not nearly enough. He saw a dazzling woman and he seduced her. We were doing good work. He started sharing ideas with me during lunches and dinners. By the start of the second week, he hugged me after dinner and kissed me. I told him I was married, but he said what happens here on mission is different. We are away from all that confines us. Ultimate libertarianism, do what thou wilt. I was missing you and his kisses were warm, and soon I wanted more, but I held back. I avoided calling you because I was embarrassed and I felt so guilty. I was very lonely and missing you. I was beginning to get suspicious that something was going on. Frank convinced me to stay for that third week. It was at the end of the third week that he offered me the job. It was good money and I loved the work. I accepted the job, signed the contract, and quit my job back home. That night Frank got me drunk and took me to his tent. He brought a strange woman to the tent, some kind of humanitarian. Last night was only our second time together. It wasn't very sober. I felt terrible guilt about it. I'm so sorry this happened. I knew you were going to break up with me, but I never expected you to come here to serve me with documents. When I saw the two of you lying together, I wanted to kill either him or myself. The pain was intolerable. You seemed so calm. I wasn't. When I saw you, I realized that I loved you more than I thought I ever could. When I got here, I had no intention of offering you a way to save our marriage. I thought it was lost, but when I saw you, I had to offer one last chance. Then you forced me right there in his tent. I've never seen you so excited. When you stood up and hugged me, I didn't know whether it was a goodbye hug or a please take me with you hug. I felt your warm, smooth, soft skin, and I had to have you, no matter what your decision would be. You had dysfunction before I left home for the mission. You sure didn't have that problem then. I think the dysfunction was more a product of my not wanting you to go. The consultation helped us uncover the reasons behind Margaret's senselessness. It was not unusual for a woman of her age to feel bored, undervalued, taken for granted. Her work was mundane and unprofitable. She was 15 years old, if her husband, so it was no secret that their married life was spotty and uninteresting. The mission trip provided meaningful, rewarding work, mystery, and excitement in an exotic environment. The illicit affair was a byproduct of all of the above, the icing on the cake, if you will. Add to that the fact that Frank was a skilled and experienced man, and the inevitable happened. We pledged to add some excitement to our lives, a weekend here and a weekend there. I also pledged to begin medication to alleviate the ED problem. She never went on another mission trip, but we did cruise to Caribbean islands as tourists. I forgave Margaret because my life was better with her than without her. I never forgave Frank King. Frank was recalled from Frobisher Island, and he was fired. Word spread to the NGO community, and soon Frank was a pariah. I lost track of him at that point. I felt my work was done. All this happened so long ago. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary. Together, 30 wonderful years with only one big bump in the road. Thank God for that. Subscribe to our channel so that your second C gaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story. Because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.